Studies Discussion Group, or ISCG at the University of Cambridge. We are grateful to the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities and the Cambridge Heritage Research Center for their support of this group and for making this event possible. The ISDG is a graduate student-led initiative started in 2019 with the objectives of one, promoting scholarship by and about Indigenous peoples across disciplines and spaces to be a regular feature of the intellectual life of Cambridge, and two, promoting the sharing and discussion of insights and ideas pertaining to Indigenous studies across peoples, disciplines, times, and geographies. We are honored to welcome everyone to today's event, which is titled Native Mascots and Misappropriation of Imagery, Symbols and Name Changes Following the Exeter Chiefs for Change campaign. We are joined by a distinguished panel of speakers today who will be sharing their experiences on this topic. So let me briefly introduce you to each of our speakers. LeAndra Nephin is a member of the Omaha tribe of Nebraska and Iowa and is currently studying for a master's in science in cognitive behavioral therapy at the University of Oxford. LeAndra is also the founder of the Native Americans in the UK group that contributed significantly to the campaign to change the Exeter Chiefs mascot. Welcome, LeAndra. Tony Perry is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, and he is an author, healthcare quality improvement manager in the NHS, and also a member of the Native Americans in the UK group that contributed to the campaign. Welcome, Tony. Rhonda LeValdo is Acoma, Pueblo, and currently is a faculty member in media and communications at Haskell Indian Nations University and a member of Not in Our Honor, which has been campaigning to eliminate all native imagery and change the name of the Kansas City NFL team. Welcome, Rhonda. And Elizabeth Holloway is from the UK and is a fan of the Exeter Chiefs and a member of the Exeter Chiefs for Change campaign that has worked to change the mascot of the Exeter rugby team. Welcome, Elizabeth. And finally, our chair for today's panel is Devlin Gandy, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and currently a PhD student in archaeology at the University of Cambridge. Welcome, Devlin. But before I hand it off to Devlin, I'd like to go over some housekeeping points. Firstly, please keep your microphones turned off. The event will be recorded, so please keep that in mind and keep your cameras on and off as you prefer. By remaining in the room as we record the meeting, you do consent to be recorded, though you won't appear on camera unless you speak. The recording will be available on the Crash website and on the ISDG Cambridge YouTube channel soon after the event. During the Q&A, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send a message to the general chat. And we will read it out loud. If you want to ask a question in person, please indicate that in the chat as well. Captioning has been enabled for the event. If you'd like to have captioning, you can select it at the bottom of your screen. Please note that the captions are provided by Zoom and Crash cannot be held responsible for the accuracy, but rest assured you'll be able to revisit the event recordings on YouTube. And we are doing our best to provide an inclusive environment in this online event, so it goes without saying that all attendees are expected to show respect and courtesy to the speakers and each other throughout the event. If you do not, we will boot you out of the room. All right, with that, I would like to hand it over to Devlin.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Oliver, for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here today with a distinguished group of Native scholars and also activists who has helped bring about change with the Exeter Chiefs. And to begin, I'm actually going to ask Elizabeth, could you give us some information and some context just about the Exeter Chiefs Rugby Club?
Sure, I'll give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So Exeter is a city in Devon in the West Country. Lots of you will know that. Some might not. West Country of the UK, of England. It's a very, very rural part of the country. There's Cornwall and then Devon. So it's beaches, it's hills, it's fields, it's farming. Exeter is the city there. It's had a rugby team for 150 years. Rugby in the UK is the second most popular sport, I think it is, but it's a long way behind football, soccer. The money is nowhere near that's in the football sport, but it's increasingly becoming more popular. And rugby in the UK, rugby union, went professional in the late 90s. So as part of that, quite a few of the teams were trying to work out how to commercialize and brand themselves and take advantage of the fact that they become a professional sport. And Exeter, was always known as Exeter Rugby Club officially, was looking for a nickname, and they decided upon the Chiefs. Seems quite random. There is a little bit of a reasoning why they used the word Chiefs, and then they just unfortunately went in a bit of a questionable direction with it. So the word Chiefs, it has been long used as a kind of informal nickname for the first team at sports clubs in the West Country. And so it's kind of, you call the first team the Chiefs. Somebody was playing for the Chiefs this weekend, and so that was the suggestion that was made to the owner of the club. And then obviously it's quite a kind of basic marketing, graphic design, the obvious is to then draw the big Native American chief head and use all that kind of indigenous imagery as is being used at so many American sports clubs. So that's what they started doing in 1999. Obviously, that's actually not that long ago. Campaigns have been happening for decades before that in the US, but they were pretty oblivious to all that. Then objections did start around the early 2010s. I think there's been a few mentions. There was a piece in the New York Times looking at European sports clubs that used Indigenous imagery, and that had quite a few paragraphs on Exeter Chiefs, and they were approached for comment on that. And a couple of people had written kind of academic articles, and an Indigenous lady who was living in Devon at the time wrote quite a big piece for the local paper about it in about 2013, 2014, I think. So the objections had kind of been there bubbling under, but then a few of us had been kind of having individual conversation, individual thoughts, and then it all kind of escalated in the last couple of years.
Gotcha. Thank you for that really great synopsis of the team. LeAndra, Tony? I'd love to ask you guys, what are your experiences of becoming aware of the Exeter Chiefs name and that context?
Yeah, so for me, I mean, I was aware, again, like as Elizabeth said, I echo the point is sort of bubbling under the surface, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're living here as a Native American in the United Kingdom, you become acutely aware of some of these issues that are kind of, basically in your backyard in a sense. But basically, I was sort of kind of aware of it. I knew that it was a conversation that was happening. A member of the Exeter Chiefs for Change team actually reached out to me, Alex Burhouse, and said, we started this campaign as a group of fans. We're recognizing that this is actually really problematic for us, and we're starting to feel kind of ashamed even to be a part of this. So we were wondering if we could partner with you and the group that I started of Native Americans who are living here in the United Kingdom. And so we had a few conversations and we started to kind of collaborate together. And with that, I brought on, Tony Perry came on board, yourself, Devlin Gandy, you were there part of that conversation, and a few others in our group. And so that's kind of how we became involved with the campaign, just to kind of lend a voice from an Indigenous perspective of an individual who's Native living in the UK. So I think some of the arguments around that were proximity. Why would Native Americans living across, the ocean be even aware of us, or why would they even care? So it kind of really brought to light that actually there is a community of Native Americans who are living in the UK. And so I don't know if Tony wants to add a little bit more context in terms of his involvement.
Yeah, as LeAndra said, I joined when LeAndra had let me know about her communication with Exeter Chiefs for Change. This was at the height of the George Floyd death and the controversy and the protests that were happening not only in the United States, but of course here in the United Kingdom. And so it was a time of real reflection about about Britain's colonial past and history and its relationships with people of color or Black minority ethnic people today. And so for me, it felt a logical extension of the conversation because we are still here. And there is so much about Native people. I mean, I knew that the Chiefs were there and having their mascots and everything else going on, but they didn't feel like there was much I could do about it. And when the George Floyd movement and protests of Black Lives Matter movement came, that created an opportunity, along with what the Exeter Chiefs for Change group did, to have these conversations and to reinforce, as LeAndra said, we're still here. We are here. You know, there's a deep relationship between Britain and Native Americans that exist, you know, that preceded the United States, certainly amongst my ancestors. And so to show, you know, we have had a role to play within Britain as it is now, and we are actually still here, and we are also part of the British family as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of add to that point as well. I mean, you know, part of my purpose in kind of creating our community here was to tackle these issues, right, between Indigenous and British relationships, to almost kind of, in a sense, create change in the colonial empire. And that work is continuing today in terms of our involvement with the curriculum, teaching colonialism in UK schools. So this is a really important kind of key aspect in terms of us kind of creating or changing the narrative, you know, taking control of that definition of what is honorable to us.
And I think it's probably worth adding from the kind of Exeter Chiefs for Change point of view, we're a really small group, we're 10 people. We are mostly Exeter Chiefs fans. 7 of us are Exeter Chiefs fans, a couple more support other rugby teams, and 1 kind of non-rugby fan. So those of us, you know, it's something that we each had had concerns about individually. You know, we'd seen the campaigns happening elsewhere and thought, how is it any different for our club? It's not. And in fact, 2 of our members had connected on Twitter several years ago when they were both making this point. But it was, as Tony said, it was the Black Lives Matter movement, and that, you know, during the pandemic, those kind of early days of all of us looking and going, am I being anti-racist enough? Am I doing enough? Am I sticking my hand out to call out what I can see that's wrong in the communities that I have a play in, and to look at the opinions and the views and things and the prejudices that we each hold as an individual. And it was at that point that we went, well, hang on, this is something that's bugged me for a while, you know, and just because it's the sports team that I support, it doesn't seem right to turn a blind eye to it. And so that was how the campaign formed, was each of us kind of going through that thought process and that journey, and each connecting on social media and then deciding to form the campaign and do something about it.
Amazing, amazing. I mean, myself, I've only been in the UK for about 5 years, but I would say really from my earliest experiences in the UK, the use of native imagery and native terminology in like product marketing, in social events, in just common speech as well. It was actually kind of really, in some ways, deeply surprising, but not when I thought about it further, that there's kind of this structural racism that's built into a lot of just pop culture. And so kind of seeing these larger conversations brought about is really inspiring. Also, just the timing of this, it was going on a momentum of social movement that everybody else also was being able to have the time to have more introspective dialogue because of the dialogues that are happening in other communities. And I think that really brought about a positive moment for all of us. So that's really great to see. Elizabeth, one question. I mean, the awareness of Native people and the conversations related to just how racism is viewed in the UK, often, I feel like there's a gap and sometimes the understanding. How did you kind of really come to see this as an issue?
Completely agree. I think it's something that those of us who the non-native parts of our campaign, we've all found this, like, it's been a journey for us. You know, there is virtually no awareness really of actually any genuine aspects of Indigenous culture in the UK. It doesn't come up in any part of schooling. It doesn't come up in culture. Obviously, now that you're starting to get some pop culture stuff and some of the new TV shows and some of the, you know, anti-mascot campaigns in the US, some of those are filtering over a little bit, but you still have to kind of be looking for that. So there was so much we didn't know. Like, I've learned so much over the last couple of years. I think quite a few of us didn't even really appreciate all the different nations and all the different variations between that. So that was a really important thing to understand, first of all, is that it's obviously so fundamental into that issue of stereotyping and trying to have something that's reducing all these like various cultures, which is so differing, into one image. And so that's why things like the Exeter Chiefs imagery are actually causing more harm, because they're making people think that they know something about it, and actually the very tiny thing they're being told is completely wrong and misleading. So I think that has been a massive issue, and it's one thing that is a parallel that we all have reflected on so much since the beginning, of saying, if this was any other culture, religion, nationality, you know, any other group of people, any other identity, it would not be happening. You know, that's the thing that blows my mind. I cannot think of a single other race, nationality, religion, what have you, where this would be allowed to continue. So why is it different for Indigenous and Native people? I still can't figure that out.
That's one that I struggled with as well. I mean, some of the things that would be considered hate speech in this country, you know, wearing blackface or things like this. Or so, if they had said half the things that I have had fans of the Exeter Chiefs say to me, particularly through social media, and it was referring to someone else that was not Native American, but another minority ethnic person, it would fall well within hate speech, but it's accepted. And so the kind of conversations that we have to deal with it, to address, you know, to make the argument, are also very different, because we don't have the same safeguards or guardrails that other peoples of color have here in this country.
And it means that people just think it's like positive. You know, the classic is, but we're honoring, you know, it's because they're a brave warrior. And again,
even when we tell you you're not, they insist that they are.
Right?
No, exactly.
It's just mind-blowing. I don't understand why it's so different from everything else. And it was something that we constantly tried to use in the messaging, you know, when explaining to people, both informally but also in our kind of website and our media interviews and stuff, is to try and just get people to reframe it a bit differently. And actually it's the main reason why it was so important for us to reach out to actual Indigenous people so early on. Like we'd seen, you know, the campaigns elsewhere, and that's where a lot of us had gone, you know, this isn't different for our club. If it's a problem for Washington and Kansas and everybody, it's Kansas City, it's a problem for Exeter. But actually, as I said, there was still so much we didn't know, and obviously we each were doing our own kind of research and reading, but it was really important from us early on to straight away find out from those communities and those individuals and organizations that were involved in that and did have kind of skin in the game there, and then to make sure that the campaign was, you know, the direction was driven by them, that everything was centered around their experiences and the impact on those communities.
It's absolutely wonderful to hear, and a wonderful case, a wonderful framework to start to bring about change. I'd like to switch to Rhonda. And ask you if you could explain a bit about your work in Kansas City and focusing on changing the name and the mascots there.
Yeah, so we started our group with college students in 2005 while we were trying to raise awareness of, at the time, Kansas City was playing Washington, and we just wanted to make sure people knew that, you know, there was a group of Native people here that didn't appreciate the names and the names that they were going by. And so we organized our group and managed to get more students within the area to help us out. It actually turned out to be a very big protest because we were able to reach so many people across the Midwest, and we had hundreds of people that were here supporting us, and it was a great turnout. And we decided from that point on that we were at least going to, you know, bring about and raise awareness at least once a year at Kansas City. When the death of George Floyd happened, the social justice movement started going on. We felt it was important for us to also bring to light our issues with Kansas City. And so we started attending every home game in Kansas City, again, to raise awareness. And we were able to, you know, get other groups of people to join us as well. And especially when they went to the Super Bowl, we made sure we were down there at Super Bowl as well, to make our voices heard, and that was very impactful. We've been able to get billboards, planes with banners flying overhead, and not just in our city, but in other cities as well, which I think they were surprised that we were doing this. And we just want to make sure they know that, you know, we're not going to go away. We're going to keep doing this to make sure they know that we do not enjoy it. And they have a working group within their team that they call their American Indian Working Group. It's like 8 people. And, you know, they haven't reached out to any local Native American organizations to say, hey, what do you guys think? Kansas City Indian Center has been here for over 40 years and they have not reached out to them. They provide food, COVID tests, PPE to all these groups in the Kansas City area, and you know, their organization has not reached out to them as well. They don't want to deal with us. They want to ignore us. And so, but we keep pushing our message out there, and we're going to continue next season. We're working on something right now to raise awareness again of how they're, you know, separating us from being a part of, you know, their group. It's like, we want to participate as well. And we can't do that with the name they have. And so we're going to keep making sure they're aware that we want to be involved and talk to them. But it's kind of funny how they just put us on mute.
Yeah, no, I mean, looking at their actions over the past decade, it really kind of seems like they're just pulling a little bit of less racism, less racism, less racism, less racism. Like, how much can you tolerate that we can still keep our franchise and not make any meaningful change or structural difference? It's incredibly problematic. Looking at the history of Kansas City Chiefs, though, it also, in some ways, it kind of mirrors the Exeter Chiefs, where you have, for example, a group, I believe it was originally called the Dallas Texans, correct?
Yeah, they were called the Texans when they were moved to Kansas City.
Yeah, and again, there was named Chiefs not for any Native American individual, but for a nickname, correct?
Yeah, so the person who brought him to Kansas City, his name was Mayor Robartle. He actually had an affinity for Native Americans and our culture. And so he made up a group called the Mikase, which is a group of non-natives who dress up like Native Americans, and they do our dances. They make outfits. They do this, you know, in their private little area in the woods somewhere. They say that it's honoring us, and of course it doesn't honor us. They gave him the name of Chief Robartle. They make up their own Indian names to give one another. Some of them are just completely crazy. And so his was Chief. And so that's how they came about with the Kansas City Chiefs. And, you know, to this day, you always have fans that say, oh, it's named after the mayor. It's not named after Native Americans. So why are you using our imagery? Why are you using Arrowhead Stadium? Why are you using, you know, the arrowhead on the helmets? And, you know, at the same time on the helmets on the back, it says #EndRacism. And you're putting that together with using our imagery. They still have a drum. It's a humongous drum that they have a spirit leader go and hit it to get everybody hyped up, and then they all do the chop. And again, which is very cringy, very gross and disgusting. And, you know, that again, when they say that they're not named after Native Americans, then why are you using all this imagery and, you know, bastardizing our culture for your entertainment? That's, you know, one thing we always want to make sure that people understand is like, why would you do that to our culture?
I think it's always quite a fun parallel when fans go, no, you can't take away our identity. It's like, hang on a minute.
It's an incredible cognitive dissonance there. Yeah. No, it's remarkable.
I think the one I struggled with most was exactly the point that Rhonda made about you know, having the arrowhead or, you know, the Chiefs sign and saying end racism. We've had the same sort of thing here within rugby, like with a Rugby Against Racism campaign. And for me as a Native American here, that dissonance is just jarring. And I think that's one of the things that I struggled with most, because it's actually even a deeper insult, because we're even below being worth recognizing as distinct people. You know, our cultures and history are just not even worth even mentioning about being distinct at all, or worthy of even existing beyond something that other people can just play and pretend as costumes.
Right. And I think it's too this kind of like assertion of basically their sense of egalitarianism, right? That masks the genocidal nature or relationship between white European settlers and indigenous communities. And so us kind of coming in and taking over the narrative and saying, you know, we define what is Native American. We are the ones who control that narrative. That challenge, you know, they take that as a personal attack because we're challenging the Western mythology, you know, the ideology of white supremacy. So it's sort of, you know, that whole defense, you know, of honoring us and you know, doing the tomahawk chop chant and all of these things that are just a desecration of our cultural ways, is just really sickening. And it just really, you know, is nice to kind of, you know, start having these conversations around Britain's colonial legacy. And we're a part of that conversation. And, you know, on top of that, you know, we're actually showing a nice kind of collaboration in terms of allyship and what that looks like. You know, not this kind of optical or performative allyship, but allyship that actually gets to the root of, you know, our own kind of biases. You know, our allies are actually questioning what biases and prejudices do I hold. And so it kind of acted even as an educational kind of tool or mechanism in terms of getting Exeter Chiefs to get in touch with their own ancestral heritage.
And I think on that point as well, it's about being able to work with our strengths. So the Exeter Chiefs for Change group and Elizabeth, and in particular, I'd say, you know, in terms of the experience with public relations and how to approach media and that sort of thing, and then being able to combine that with, you know, as a Native person, our lived experience and perspectives and the deeper issues behind, you know, this imagery and why it's so problematic for non-natives to be doing this and trying to honor us. It became together as really well. It was like a tag team in a lot of ways, and I found that incredibly helpful. I think it would be almost a case study in allyship at some point down the road.
And actually, funnily enough, one of my PR colleagues did say to me a couple of months ago, you need to write this down because it's a case study in general PR communications, you know, issue management as well.
Yep, agree. And then that again with allyship.
I have lots of experience of issue management from the other side. And so I was constantly able to put myself in the shoes of Exeter Chiefs and think, here's all the things they're doing wrong. You know, when you're on the receiving end of a campaign like this, you know, from week to week, they were a case study in how not to handle it. But it meant that we were also then able to stay almost a step ahead.
Looking at it collectively, it's actually somewhat interesting. I mean, just what we're all touching on is like this broader relationship between colonial and settler states and entities relating to Native and Indigenous people. I mean, this is this much broader conversation that we're really dealing with, and kind of this larger relationship between, you know, how these states seek to commoditize and incorporate Native lands, Native bodies, Indigenous knowledge into their mechanism of creating and aggregating wealth. And so looking at like these broader topics, and also know how one of the basic things that you're pointing out, Elizabeth and Tony, is also the need for conversation as well, and looking at the ways that you can reach out to larger communities and raise voices and get dialogue across where people previously hadn't heard it. Rhonda, I'm really curious about just your viewpoint or perspective on, for example, the larger relationship between Native imagery, Native mascots, especially in the United States, and kind of that history between the United States and the relationship between Native communities and Indigenous communities.
Yeah, so that's like one of the things I teach about here. So I work at Haskell Indian Nations University. It is a former boarding school. We started out as a bad thing, you know, because children were taken from their families and they were taken as babies and stripped of their culture, you know, their haircut, their clothes taken away. They were made to be good Americans and lose their culture. which was done effectively. We have so many of our own people who don't know their own language or don't know their own customs. And, you know, we've been able to turn that around because we now indigenize our curriculum, or we're teaching our students to be aware of their Indigenous sides and their culture and to learn about it. And so, you know, one of the things that I always talk about is this historical trauma that happens to our students when they're learning this, when they're understanding really the impact of what happened to our people when the school first started, and it trickles down to who we are today. And I have come to realize that I have to put a disclaimer with my students in class, because I have to tell them, you know, this stuff may affect you later on. You know, you may be by yourself and all of a sudden you feel like crying. You understand what happened to our people. We were not allowed to be Native American. Why is it okay for a football team to be Native American and their fans to be Native American when it was against the law for us to practice our own religion and our own culture? And that was stripped away from us. We weren't even citizens of this country until 1924. And so, you know, when you have an NFL team making tons of money off our culture and our imagery, and we weren't even allowed to be Native, they don't understand that aspect of history, because that aspect of history is never taught in the curriculum in high schools, in grade schools, and it needs to be taught. And there's a movement to do this, even within the Kansas area, to have that aspect taught so people understand why we are against them using this type of stuff for their football team. And, you know, understanding that our people were killed for being Native. And even today, this is an ongoing effect that we are the most, you know, the things that happen to our people today, are women going missing and murdered, young kids. You know, there was a story of a young boy in school who had his hair cut, you know, in school by his fellow students. And then just recently, another high school had some crazy text messages sent saying they wanted to bomb their school so all the Native kids would die. You know, when you talk about the amount of racism that Native people feel every single day of our lives, that we have to deal with this. I know I feel it every day because I'm on Twitter trying to get our message out about Kansas City, and I get a lot of irate fans at me. But one of the things I always try to explain is if you go to our site, you're going to learn a lot of history that you didn't know about and understand why we are doing this, because we want to reclaim our history back. We want our land back. We want everything back, because it shouldn't be in your hands. This is not your culture. This is our culture. And so, you know, a part of this is all educating others on history, on what happened to us as, you know, a long time ago, and then what's happening to our people today. I would love to be a part of society where we don't have to do this anymore, where our kids don't have to deal with worrying about if their hair is going to go, you know, be cut, or if they're going to be assaulted, or if they're going to go missing. We shouldn't have to deal with that. And so, you know, I think it's important that we educate others. And I really appreciate, you know, our allies that help us out as well, because sometimes non-natives are more willing to listen to another non-native explain to them. And so I understand that. So yeah, it's all about educating people about the true history of this country.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting point, the need for both. We were constantly faced with people saying, snowflakes, call snowflakes 100 times a day, you know, and with people thinking that it's a bit of the political correctness gone mad and that we've just made this up. You know, it's like, oh, you're the kind of person who would complain that a bakery was selling gingerbread men instead of gingerbread people, you know, and obviously that's not in any way how we got involved, the roots of the campaign, the roots of the issue, like not at all. So that's, you know, why it was so important for us to constantly keep referencing and referring to and sharing the websites, the media interviews, etc., with Indigenous people, with LeAndra, with Tony, with some of the other members of Natives in the UK and some other organisations that we connected to as well, and referencing things like the NCAI and what have you. And people still really struggle with that. They still, even now the club has accepted the need to change and has announced that they'll be changing, there are still people who think the club has given into the woke mob. I think we're at a really unfortunate point in the culture war generally, which if people don't bother to do the research, and obviously the people who aren't going to do the research are the people who most need to do the research, it's very easy for them to think that they can dismiss it as just rubbish, and it not actually coming from a place of authenticity and concern with all this history, all that depth of meaning, but also the impact that it's having now. The various research reports showing the impacts of stereotyping on mental health and other representation was so important to us. We were constantly using those as well, because I think then you've got the full kind of cohort of here's the responses, like, yes, it's come from Indigenous people, yes, it's doing harm, yes, it's relevant now.
You made some really good points, Elizabeth, and thank you so much, Rhonda, for that really in-depth explanation. In terms of just being a Native person doing this kind of work, I guess one of the follow-ups to that, I mean, when you're dealing with people, one of the things that happens when someone is ignorant of a topic is sometimes you can be, because of ignorance, you're quite sure that you're right. And so when you're trying to deal with folks who are so sure that of their rightness from a state of ignorance, it can be for someone who is aware of the history and lived it and experienced it firsthand. I mean, it can be extremely difficult, traumatic, and trying. And so I'm kind of curious if you or LeAndra or Tony have anything to add to that, and just also the aspect of self-care as well through this.
Well, I know, like, just taking time off a little bit, and just I guess try not to let everything pile on, because I know there's a point where, like, you just get so many angry messages, and they find me everywhere. I'm not really a private person, so I get snail mail to my work. They know where to find me. They could come here if they want, and not just on the internet, and not just at my home. Like, I've had someone take a picture outside my house and send it to me, and I was like, wow, that's pretty crazy. But I think just taking time off and just, thinking about other things, but also just knowing that what we're doing is for the benefit of our youth and future generations.
I think
Yeah.
following, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Teddy.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think for me, it's much the same. And it was a lesson that I learned, I think, the hard way, because there were times in all of this campaign and all of this that it got quite intense. I mean, you'd raise a point on social media or call someone out, respectfully, but still call someone out, say, that's actually, this isn't honoring us, that sort of thing, and then get a whole pile of people coming back to you, and just not stopping, and not giving any ground whatsoever, even if they're blatantly wrong. And so there were points where I know I had a chat with LeAndra once or twice in this, and finally just kind of said, okay, right, you know what, they're worked up about something and they're clearly wrong, leave them to it, and so there were times where I had to do that, just a couple of days or whatever off, just to say, okay, let Twitter be Twitter, and I'm just going to switch off with the rest of my, focus on the rest of my life, and then come back if I felt like, something still needed to be said. But yeah, it's been intense.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo kind of what everybody else is saying, just because, I work as a complex trauma therapist, right? So I'm aware of kind of how activism work, while on one hand, as an Indigenous person, we are working to create social change for our future generations. I don't want my children or my grandchildren having these arguments or these discussions. Ideally, we would be moving past this. But the reality is that there's, kind of emerging literature even coming up around kind of activism work, creating PTSD-like symptoms, because it's very difficult work. It's exhausting. We're in a kind of privileged position in a sense because of COVID, the pandemic, everything has moved online. So there's a little bit of a distance, in terms of frontline activism work. We're not there kind of, face to face with people, but it doesn't mean that the threats or the words or the conversations aren't as hurtful. And I think for me, for my own self-care policy, I make my public statements and then I get out. I'm not going to engage in comments. I'm not going to engage in kind of Twitter battles or feuds, because for me, that's emotional labor that I just don't have the mental bandwidth for, right? And that was kind of my self-care. We all have our ways of coping and our ways of managing this work, but just know that this is really heavy work. It's exhausting work. I think when we got the news that it was changing, I think all of us were breathing a sigh of kind of, let's just relax. Let's just take a break. Let's take a breather. But we also recognize, yes, we're going to take that break, but we do know that there are future projects that still need addressing. And so part of that, which Tony and I and kind of Elizabeth have been talking about. But it's very much about kind of finding your balance, your equipoise. What does that look like? And for me, it was very much, I'll make my public statements, but I'm not going to engage in the comments and all of the kind of nasty, dialogue that gets bandied about. And some of them have been really threatening. I mean, some of the things that Tony, I know that you've experienced have been really quite damaging. And so, just know that what we are doing isn't for the weak. We're in that place where the spirits get eaten, as Sean Trudell says.
Yeah, and
exactly. Yeah. Go ahead, Tony.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, I think part of it for me is, I guess, just my natural reaction is pretty much as a fighter when it comes down to it, and so I did engage, probably too much in some ways, but I did engage full-heartedly back with people, and some of it's been of a learning thing, but also another part of it for me was when people are saying, oh, well, we're doing this to honor you, and I felt like if I don't say anything, then that rationale stands. And so it keeps validity, and so I felt a need to be able to challenge back. So in what ways is this not honoring us, and explaining some of the, the historical problems around mascotry and trying to play Indian, so to speak, and that runs back several hundred years of, from Britain in particular, people that are decided to be not British and trying to be something new and deciding to copy someone else's culture or their versions of it from, I believe back to the Boston Tea Party. So there's a long history to this. And so being able to make those points and then trying to tease out people's arguments as well. So as they say that we're honoring you, well, in what ways, and so on. And then just to try to take their arguments out to the ends, if you see what I mean. And so I felt I needed to do that, and in a way because it's also a public record. And so when you're engaging in these conversations and other people will see this thread, and one way, if you don't, then it kind of piles on. That justifies someone reading this with that mindset will be justified in their view. You see that we are honoring you and everything else that they had said. But if you fight back, it's like how to do it in a way that actually someone reading those arguments and those conversations will see actually, wait a minute, this isn't holding much water. And I think that was part of that and the intensity of us as a whole. I think were major parts of what turned the tide. And the other point I would add to this, and I think that really turned momentum, was actually other sports teams, in particular the Wasps rugby club, and their supporter group and their chief executive, who said, hey, actually, we're going to at least review whether or not the Chiefs are going to do it that they do in their stadium. We can't stop that. But actually, when their fans come to our stadium, are we going to put up with this? And that sparked a real conversation that actually brought back some of the momentum. When the Chiefs saw that their own peers were having questions around this, that changed it. It changed the power dynamic. Us as Native peoples trying to explain our own histories and that they're trying to honor and why it's not, didn't seem to carry much weight. They felt they could just flick us away and carry on, much like I would say what happens in the US. Rhonda can talk to that far better than I can, of course. But it was when other clubs, their peers, started to raise questions, I think that the momentum finally changed.
Yeah, I think the kind of, obviously the self-care is incredibly important, but it's also so important to enable your own perseverance, because I think there was such an assumption from the club and from most of the fans when we first started that this was a passing fad, it would be gone. It was, one news cycle, as it were. Well, we've had odd articles on this before and it's always gone away. And so it's so important for us to show it's not going away this time. This isn't something that you can hush up, or that you can, we had threats of violence. One of our members who'd been talking about this on the fan forums for several years had been banned from all the fan forums for ever starting one of these conversations. The topic got banned from the main supporters club group on Facebook. So, that was very much their attitude. And so I think it was really important to us to, as Tony said, it's momentum and it's perseverance, and it's whatever we can do to keep that perseverance going. And that kind of formed quite a strong part of our strategy after that initial first few months of raising awareness, educating, trying to reach people, and bringing it to the attention of the club, and the strength of feeling to the attention of the club and the media. And once they were like, no, we're digging our heels in, we're fine, it's okay, go away, we won't be commenting on it again. Then our strategy, one of the strands of our strategy then was, okay, well, we need to make sure they realize this isn't going away. And that's not just about it coming from us. We have to now contact as many other people who have any influence on the club whatsoever and try and persuade them of the importance of it. Because once then it becomes a fly in the ointment for everybody, for the sport, for media, for the local council and everybody, then that again, it's really ingrained. Then it's something, and so towards the end of the campaign, our messaging was as much, this is just a distraction from the rugby now. We just need this to go away, because we knew with some people who were never going to get the issue, but they could agree that they were fed up of hearing about it. And so that was, a kind of an additional strand of the messaging to really tune into that kind of section of the audience of, whatever you think of it, surely you just want it to go away now. And the only way it's going to go away is if the club do the change.
And that's a good point in of itself. Partly because the change that they're agreeing to, in a sense, it doesn't necessarily bring about new awareness, but they're just kind of tired of a topic, which is unfortunate, but it's also the truth. And like looking at these larger conversations, as Rhonda pointed out, a lot of people who have negative and racialized structural viewpoints of Native people really won't listen to Native people. There's no primacy given to our experiences or our viewpoints. I think of the recent, there's just so many cases, it's kind of hard to focus on one. I was just reading, for example, there was the issue where Native Americans were banned, for example, from a hotel just last week, for example. And so.
Oh, that too, yeah.
Yeah. So, this brings us now, I guess, we need to be closing up shortly because we're nearing the hour. But what is next? What is next, Tony?
I suppose in the very immediate future for the Exeter Chiefs campaign, they as much as they've announced the change and launched the new imagery, and that hasn't come in yet. So that will be the end of this rugby season, which will be finishes in June. So it'll be around July. So we know what the new logo and imagery will look like. We don't yet know what the kind of other paraphernalia around that will be. Will fans still be using the Tomahawk Chop chant? There were fans literally just on Saturday, front row of the terraces, live on BT Sport, not just singing the chop, but doing the action. I couldn't believe mine, had to rewind it and video it. So it's going to be really interesting, I think, to see how the club manages that transition. We know they're very reluctantly changing, but also what we as a campaign need to do to manage that transition and help people understand why the old stuff does have to go, and some of it is still an issue. So I think that's important. And then after that, I'll let Tony and LeAndra.
I think, as Elizabeth is saying, I think there's a short-term part about this transition with Exeter. But for me, I feel like this has been a victory, and it is a victory. And I cannot wait until the new branding actually takes effect, and it's happening. There will be stragglers, to put it nicely, that are sinking with the ship, but for me, I think that there's a far bigger conversation here. I mean, just looking back over, for me, what's happened over the past 2 years, this experience, and how people have dealt with this mascot issue, how they deal with Native Americans overall. And for me, I feel like this is actually a step in a much bigger journey. So, just thinking back to, the BBC just 40 years ago had a television show, the black and white minstrel show, that had up to about 16 million viewers. And, there were people at that time calling for change as well. And the BBC said, hey, this is actually a traditional show. People enjoy it. It's good-hearted family entertainment, were the actual words that they described this with. Now, would you try, people, and certainly when we were having this debate, knew wearing blackface going down the street is not a good idea, and they all agreed when I was having this discussion that it was wrong, while in the same breath saying it's perfectly fine to dress up and play Indian and wear red face and the headdress and everything else. They couldn't see any issue with that, and I think that's telling that we as Native people are clearly further behind in that journey. There's Native culture is so deeply commoditized, normalized here, or caricatures of it. There is a telecommunications company, I won't name them, that actually has a brand name based around Native gatherings and powwows and things like this. And they, that's what they do, and it's been raised. They say nothing at all. Will that happen going forward? That's an interesting question, I think. There are commentators on the BBC that will say, well, they've got a scalp. And if you think back to the roots of that, of where that comes from, it comes back into colonial times and many other problems that the commentators don't grasp at all. You can still buy Indian costumes, so to speak, I'll put in quotes, on Amazon for Halloween. I was watching a major soap opera, admittedly, just over the past week, and there were a couple of scenes where in one character's kitchen, they've got a logo of the old Indian motorcycles, if you look there, and it's the head, right? And then just last week, again, I saw like another character had a toy teepee that their child had got or something, and just kind of playing around with that, or at least it was there, and it was clearly a teepee. And it's like, well, they don't see the problem with it. It's just normalized as something that, these are brands, or these are what people do. And so I think that there's far more to do about raising awareness of Native peoples, our contributions into this country, because there are many that people don't know, but there are many, and about us still being here. But LeAndra, I'll pass it to you. I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely. And that was the whole intention of starting this group of natives in the United Kingdom, because I recognized how problematic it was in terms of education. So there are a few of our group members who are involved with university lecturers, professors. I've made, kind of a network of supporters through university institutions, Professor David Stirrup from University of Kent. We're doing a lot of kind of background stuff to start teaching accurate Indigenous history. And so there's all these kind of projects that we kind of are involved with at the moment in terms of changing curricula. But that was the whole intention. Why I started this group was that I eventually want to start a nonprofit where people come to us to ask for advice on what's appropriate about Native Americans. And we have a group of people that, that not one individual is going to speak on the whole of Indigenous, because a lot of us have, ties to our communities back home, that we can incorporate, this kind of dialogue around what's appropriate, what actually is honoring us. And so, if you want to know more, come to us. We define what's honorable to us. Indigenous people are changing the narrative even here in the colonial empire. And that's kind of the intention moving forward, is that we are here, we will be heard, and watch this space, because we do have a collective of natives who have a community here.
Indeed.
That's been one of the most inspiring things about my experiences just in the UK, is coming in contact with the group that you've put together. It's been just really amazing to see what that conversation can be, bringing, the conversations that the empire brought to us back to the empire. Rhonda, I'd love to kind of close with some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so we're going to be continuing our campaign, trying to raise awareness that, again, we have a strong contingent group in Kansas City who is wanting to change the name. We do have a petition on our website. You can go there and check it out. There's also, this will probably get some attention as well. We are, a new movie's coming out this weekend called Imagining the Indian. And this is basically kind of a historical perspective of Native mascots and Native imagery in sports. And so that's premiering this weekend in California. So, that's including us in Kansas City and what we've been doing. So again, something to just keep us in the news about, and know that we're still out here trying to educate people. But yeah, you can help us out by spreading our petition.
Awesome. We'll make sure to send that out in the follow-up email. Or if you also have the link, if you could put it in the chat link, that would be great as well. Awesome. I believe we have reached near the hour point. Is there any questions from the audience, which we could ask our participants? If so, please write in the chat. Also in the chat is Rhonda's petition. Okay, well, I don't see any questions at the moment showing up. Oliver, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, I just have some closing words. We have a
we do
question
have a
from
question.
Joseph. Yeah.
All right, let's see. We have a question from Joseph. It is being written at the moment. It is not possible to unmute. You have to write the question. Sorry, Joseph.
Sorry, there we go. Thank you for that.
Oh, there we go. Sorry.
Thanks for mute. Sorry. Thank you for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I just the whole talk got me thinking about being very amateur in my interest in American sports. The kind of stereotyping you've been speaking about, the appropriation, the campaign's all incredibly inspiring. I must say, thank you for that. I just wondered, has there been any kind of chat about the Boston Celtics in this regard? Because that kind of sticks out to me as, a logo with, a lot of problematic connotations in that regard. This kind of felt like an expert panel to sort of ask on this thing. Is that something that people have been sort of speaking about?
I've given some thought to that, and I think that the difference is that you have to listen to the people involved, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not Irish, so I can't really comment in terms of what is offensive or acceptable to Irish people. But what I would do is speak with the Irish community in the US and in Ireland, and see what they think about it, and go with that. I think that is the underlying issue here, is about listening to the people that are being represented. And if it's something that they are okay with, then that's one thing. If they have concerns, that's another. And so I think you have to go back to whichever it is, whether it's Native Americans or Irish people or other groups that are being represented in this way. You have to go back to those people and listen to what they are telling you. You can't really directly apply this experience to the Celtics or say Notre Dame and the Fighting Irish, right? I can't comment in any more informed way than say a non-native can about mascots, about native mascots.
No, absolutely. Yes. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Joseph, for the question. We do have a thank you from Sam. Thank you to all panelists, really fascinating, inspiring. The Capricorn teams in the UK, Test Valley Mohawks, etc. So there is more work to be done, but we are also at a good time for change. And I have a
question from Hannah there, I think, as well.
Yeah. I believe we are at the hour. I want to give thanks to our panelists for taking the time and just for all the hard work they've done. and I look forward to change.
Can we do we have time to answer the question from Hannah at all? Or is
Yeah,
there
I'm happy to
I
hang
didn't.
on.
Oh, I didn't
Yeah,
see.
I'm
Sorry,
happy.
I didn't see Hannah's. I apologize. My bad. Yes, please. Sorry. Where's
Someone
Hannah?
will need to unmute her.
Hi, thank you so much for hanging on. Sorry, I seem to be in darkness here. I think this is probably a question that's going to go on. I just messaged Elizabeth. My name's Hannah Jasmine, and I'm a leader of a taiko drumming group here in Exeter. So that is a Japanese art form that I've been involved with for many years. I was trained in most of my training in California with Japanese American people. So I have had a really interesting relationship with the Exeter Chiefs because they have given us funding because I work in the community and go and work with different children and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I have a group and we have performed on pitch many times for the Exeter Chiefs as a kind of repayment for their funding to our group. I drove a van around for a really long, it felt like a long time, for about 18 months with the Exeter Chiefs logo on the side of the van and felt deeply, deeply uncomfortable about it. I went to my mentors and my peers in the taiko community and said how deeply uncomfortable I was with it. And it got to the point where I just couldn't hack it anymore and ended up reaching out to the Exeter Chiefs for change because I didn't want to be part of the cancel culture and just say, look, we're done, have your money back, we're off. But I feel like I've been part of the problem. You know, we refused to play on pitch with their mascots. We've refused to play certain rhythm patterns that they wanted us to play because they saw that it was like a cool drumming, hype everybody up. But at the same time, this is an authentic to us drumming thing and we're local. And so it was kind of a big mess. So I am really interested because I'm now in conversation with the Chiefs organisation about their rebranding and about how they want their entertainment on pitch to be. And I'd rather be part of that conversation than just exit it. But I feel really ill-equipped to be in that conversation. And I really would like to have further relationships with people like you who know way more about this. I'm so late to being as educated as I want to be about it, but I feel like I wrote to them, told them how deeply uncomfortable I was and that we were removing all of their logos and that we were kind of, that in this situation. And of course, then the change came about. So I suppose I have less a question than like, I want to be in conversation and I want advice. Like, is it going to be more powerful if we just say enough's enough, we're going to walk away? ... That's my kind of roundabout question of I need help. I'm so glad I came to this conversation and I really want to have an ongoing discussion because I feel like I have been part of the problem by taking money from the club and then got tied into using their logos next to something that is already culturally part of our work is to educate people about cultural sensitivities around Japanese Americans and their histories. And anyway, that's my bit. And I just wanted to say that I'm here to listen and I want some advice. So I don't know if that's a question.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you for just bringing that conversation forward. I guess my first is Tony or LeAndra. Do you have anything you want to add to that right now?
LeAndra, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so there's a lot of layers to this, right? In terms of kind of approaching things from a culturally sensitive perspective, around misappropriation. I think that those conversations need to be had with Native people. And I think that is a conversation that probably has its place, but I also kind of, I don't know, I have concerns. I can't speak for the Japanese people, but, do they, condone this? And how is that mishmash being kind of approached in terms of the club? And I guess there are a lot of kind of nuances to this in terms of what you're asking, but ultimately, the club is rebranding. I mean, is there a space for kind of the Dumani tribe? Did they, you know, because we all wore feathers and bones and, you know, kind of had drums at one point, you know, this is again, hearkening back to John Trudell. You know, we don't need this kind of predatory colonial mindset, you know, in terms of how we are approaching these cultures. And I think there just needs to be some cultural humility in terms of, you know, what space are you occupying in that conversation? You know, could there be maybe even a change to learning kind of the more Neolithic types or ways of, you know, that could really draw on, you know, the ancestry of the Devonian people. Because I do believe that that's the key to that, you know, in terms of, you know, steering away from Indigenous kind of cultural ways and kind of really centering it on that kind of more Neolithic, you know, rooted ancestry that I think would be incredibly powerful, particularly with their rebrand. So that's, I guess, what I would say about that. You know, if there's any kind of conversation around the, you know, continuation of Native, I think that there does need to be an end point. Like we aren't doing this anymore, right?
Yeah, and just following on from that too, I think, you know, I think that the conversations that Exeter should be having is, well, how do we learn about the culture that we are now embracing, which is actually closer to their own community, which is great. And so trying to understand about, say, their music or their traditions, and using this actually as an educational opportunity. I think it's actually quite exciting. You know, the University of Exeter have done a lot of work around the Dumnomni and other Paleolithic people, so pre-Roman times as well. And so just trying to raise awareness about within the community and the wider country. Just to give an example, there's an exhibit at the British Museum now about life at the time of Stonehenge. So obviously that's focusing more around Stonehenge and that site, but there were networks, and it's an opportunity to try to learn more, and the club could do more as well. So I think the conversations, in my mind, should be focused more around who were these people? What were they like? What about them do we want to embrace? How do we educate our community, and how do we grow as a club? You know, embracing our past and taking that into the future. I think that's probably where the best conversation should be. I don't know what more the Exeter Chiefs would want with Native Americans. I will say that we have made ourselves available to the club quite regularly over the past couple of years, and none of those opportunities were taken up. But the conversation is moving on, and that's a good thing for us. There are, you know, if anyone is concerned about education about Native peoples, as LeAndra said, there's work going on that she's doing around curriculum reform. I've written historical fiction books, and others are writing about Native life today. And there is, you know, so there's a lot ongoing, and there are ways that we can help with that in the wider conversations in the country. But yeah, and I would also say, Hannah Jasmine, I think it's great that you're raising the question. And what I would also, just another point I would touch to that is, you're right, just disengaging, I don't think, is the answer. I think it's constructively engaging and trying to understand different points of views, including theirs, to understand some of the assumptions and see and find some of the faults in these arguments, and use that to educate and use that to learn, you know, for yourself, because I've certainly learned a lot over the past couple of years, and the club as well, hopefully, because if you're talking with them, then they are listening to you. So I would say that really engage, but just try to learn as much as you can, and speak with people directly. In you know, if it's about Native American issues, try to find Native Americans. We're here, you know, and there are others. So yeah, just find the people involved and listen to them, and then use that. If you've got a way of communicating to them, you be that voice for them.
I think on the Devon culture, there's the Royal Albert Museum in Exeter, I know, is doing a lot about Devons and culture. And we had a very strong relationship from very early in the campaign with Exeter Culture, which incorporates the Arts Council, the Devon County Council, Exeter City Council, the college and the university, and some other bodies. So they're doing a lot of work to bring to get the whole city and the whole county kind of talking more about its own history. So I can put you in contact with them as well. They've been a huge support, and they also do have a relationship with the club.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth. Maybe private message Hannah so she has your email.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. With this, again, I want to thank all of you for taking part in this, and I'll hand it back to Oliver.
Thank you, Devlin. In closing, I'd just like to thank all of our speakers, LeAndra, Tony, Rhonda, and Elizabeth, for sharing your experiences and knowledge with us today. It's really been an honor to learn from you, from your collaboration and achievements, which are certainly inspiring. And I hope we can all move forward with a lot of the points raised towards the end of the talk and turn them also into more real change, like the campaign has done. And we also thank Devlin for chairing today's event and guiding the conversation so expertly. So thank you, Devlin, and thanks also to our audience for joining us. We hope we will see many of you at our next event, which is on the 5th of April, and it's titled The Present and Future of Community-Based Research, and it's running during the Cambridge Festival. So I'll also add a link to that in the comments. For more details and previous recorded events and our full program of events, you can also visit our Crash website and our main webpage, which will also be linked in the chat. And to get involved or give us feedback or suggestions for future events, please write to us at the emails that we'll also be sharing in the chat. But with that, thank you once again to all of our speakers, and have a great rest of your evening, everyone.
Thanks so much for having us.
Everybody.
It's been an honor to be part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
LeValdo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night. Good evening. Good rest of the day as well. There's the potential.
There's some days